Honored to be joined here by Sebastian Junger, who's made amazing documentaries such as Restrepo. His newest one is called Hell on Earth, about Syria, and he's also the author of the book called Tribe. So let's give Sebastian a warm Google welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
So we're going to start off talking about your Hell on Earth. Maybe we can go into why you decided to jump into that topic, what inspired you to get involved.
Yeah, so I became a war reporter in the early 90s. I went to Sarajevo, to Bosnia. This is, of course, before the U.S. was involved as a peacekeeping force. And I continued covering civil wars throughout the 90s. I first went to Afghanistan in 1996. I watched as the Taliban prepared to overrun Kabul and Jalalabad. Then again in 2000, then I was in Sierra Leone and Liberia. Most of my experience as a war reporter has been with the local population and in wars that the U.S. wasn't involved in and wasn't thinking about. And then my colleague and I, Tim Hetherington, spent time with U.S. forces in eastern Afghanistan in Kunar province and made a documentary called Restrepo. We went to the Oscars. We were nominated for an Oscar. We didn't win. A few weeks later, we were supposed to go on assignment to Libya to cover the Libyan civil war. It was part of the sort of Arab Spring uprisings that were so interesting and complicated, a really complicated moment for the Arab world. The last minute, I couldn't go. Tim went on his own and he got killed in the city of Misrata. He was hit by mortar fragments from a mortar fired by Gaddafi's forces, and he bled out in the back of a pickup truck from a wound that I think didn't necessarily have to be mortal. But no one around him knew what to do. Not the rebels and not the other journalists had any medical training at all. He just bled out from a few minutes from a hospital. And after that, I decided to stop war reporting. But Syria turned into this sort of the worst case scenario. I mean, all the Arab Spring countries went through what they went through. Tunisia ended pretty well. Libya is still pretty rocky, but it's quieted down. Syria was just full-on bloodbath, 400,000 people dead at this point, millions of refugees. A lot of international interest converging on the problem and making it worse. And so my colleague and I, Nick Quested, decided we really had to examine the case of Syria. Like, how did it start? What went wrong? Why is there a civil war there? And particularly, how did ISIS come out of this? I mean, Syria is the only country that produced something like ISIS. And ISIS really is just sort of remarkable in its depravity and its violence and its pretension to religious purity. And so we just felt it was an important thing to explain. And of course, you want to make something that helps people come to a good decision about what to do. And that's always in the back of any journalist's mind or filmmaker's mind. So that's how we wound up focusing in Syria.
Gotcha. And so you used Syrians on the ground to record your footage and whatnot?
Yeah, I mean, for the first time in my life, I made a film and wasn't on the ground shooting. In fact, I didn't even leave the United States. I was writing a book. I was writing my book Tribe and promoting it. Nick went overseas. It was a suicide mission to go into Syria itself. They were kidnapping journalists and cutting their heads off on camera. I mean, danger on the battlefield's one thing. The risk of being kidnapped and executed is an entirely different kind of risk that really almost no one has the stomach for, and I certainly don't. So what we were able to do, what Nick was able to do, was along the Turkish-Syrian border, he found people, fixers and people who had family in Syria, friends in Syria. He found people that knew people in Syria who were documenting their own civil war with cameras. And we started working with, and we would get cameras to people in there. We started working with people who were stuck in the civil war, either just as civilians or they were Syrian cameramen who wanted to document what was happening to their country. We started working with them sort of remotely. We would get thumb drives into them, we'd get cameras into them, we'd give them shooting instructions, and then we'd get this material back out. And it was a very, in some ways, awkward way to make a film compared to just being on the ground shooting, but it also had enormous advantages in addition to the fact that it was just safer for us, but it had other sort of creative advantages as well.
Can you talk about the backdrop of Syria, like the different political entities that are involved right now in the civil war?
Yeah, I mean, it's super complicated, of course. And Nick really was the expert about that stuff. I mean, he did 30-some trips over there, and he really got into the weeds with Syrian politics. And he didn't successfully completely drag me into the weeds with him. But from what I understand, of course, you've got the Assad regime. It's backed by Iran, heavily aided by Hezbollah, and backed by the Russians, by Putin. So you're not going to topple a regime that has friends like that, right? Assad's not going anywhere. In the beginning of the war, the Free Syrian Army was largely, it was the product of a popular uprising, an uprising that was protesting not only the deep, deep corruption of the Assad regime, but also the just unspeakable brutality of the security forces that kept them in power. Security forces that were completely okay with detaining teenage boys who had sprayed graffiti on a wall, down with Assad, just something like that, completely okay with detaining 15-year-old boys and torturing them to death. Like, that was how the revolution started, with parents whose boys had been detained and were in a police station, parents massing in front of the police station, demanding the release of their children, and finally storming the police station to save them. And then the security forces opening fire on the parents. Like, that's how the Civil War started. And sometimes in this country, what I hear from people is, it's crazy, it's a civil war. If those people want to kill each other, you can't tell them apart, just let them kill each other. I mean, people have to understand how these things start. They start with obscenities like that situation in Dara, the town of Dara. So the FSA came out of that. And of course, the longer a war goes on, the more chance you have of a popular and more or less democratic movement metastasizing, having some parts of it metastasize into radicalization, into really sort of like vicious anti-Western thought. It becomes just as inhuman and cruel as the regime they're protesting. So, one of the moral and practical arguments for intervening early on in civil wars is that it keeps that kind of radical cancer from starting. And once it started, it's really hard to stop. I mean, just like with cancer in the human body, it's really, really hard to stop. And that's what happened. The FSA splintered. Some groups got really radicalized. Al-Qaeda came in, and eventually ISIS was sort of incubated and born in the vacuum in Iraq after the U.S. withdrawal, and migrated into Syria and really got a foothold in Syria.
In the documentary, you follow a particular family. Can you talk about how you guys got connected to them?
Yeah.
And then maybe an update on what the family's doing now, if you're still in contact.
Yeah, so it's the two families of brothers, Marwan and Radwan. One was a garage mechanic, another had a little cell phone shop in Aleppo. And they were pushed out of Aleppo by the fighting to a town called Manbij. ISIS took over Manbij. They were living under ISIS control with their children, with their wives and their children. And the Russian Air Force and Assad's Air Force was bombing Manbij pretty regularly. And so what Nick managed to do was he knew the brother, he knew a third brother that was actually in Turkey. And he said, listen, would you think your family, those families would like to document life under ISIS for us? We'll pay them, or they'd shoot for us. So they agreed to. And so we got them a camera, like a very nondescript, low-profile Samsung 7 cell phone camera, basically. The kind that everybody has, so they're not calling attention to themselves. And they self-documented. They documented their lives under ISIS, the conversations they had about if they should try to escape, what are the risks of escaping, and they documented the escape itself. They were, basically under a tarpaulin in the back of a truck, driving through ISIS checkpoints, through no man's land, into FSA territory, eventually into Turkey. And keep in mind, just imagine, those of you who have children, doing a journey like that, knowing that if you get stopped at a checkpoint and they pull the tarpaulin back and they discover you, you and your family will be lined up and machine gunned. Like that's what the stakes were. And they documented all of this, and thank God they got out safely. They got to Turkey. Nick met them in Turkey and got to meet them and then started shooting them himself. And then they continued on with their camera onto a Zodiac, a rubber Zodiac, trying to get to Greece. And the last moment were turned back by the Turkish Coast Guard. So that was, I mean, some of the most extraordinary parts of the film are parts that, you know, this is just this family shot. And it really, it's a whole new way of thinking about filmmaking. Even if we'd been able to go in there, it would have been like a Westerner with with a video camera in the middle of this very intimate family situation. It would have altered it. It would not be the reality that you're seeing here. And so there is something to be said for asking people to self-document, as long as you kind of trust that they're not manipulating you. I mean, that's the only downside to it.
And there's a scene when one of the families, the husband and wife, were talking, and he was making a decision if they should flee or not.
Yeah.
And they were arguing right in front of like 6 of their children, and it just really hit home there about how terrible the crisis is.
Yeah, I mean, they're stuck in Turkey, so they're safe, but they're miserable. And they're arguing about whether to risk the boat passage. And you all know, there were a lot of people drowned, a lot of loss of life on these Zodiacs, of people trying to get from North Africa to Europe, from Turkey to Greece. And the wife is like, the mother is saying, one big wave and I lose all my children. And he is saying, okay, but at least we'll die together. And right now we're stuck in Turkey. Our children have no future at all. I say it's better that we gamble on giving them a future, or we die together, and that's God's will. And the husband eventually won the argument.
There's an argument in the West that during all this chaos, that the people who are leaving should stay there, they should fight or something. But I think after you're watching this documentary, you realize how much of a terrible situation they're in right now. For the people that are the diaspora, did you talk to any of them to see if they're willing to go back to Syria, or are they thinking?
I mean, most of the refugees that Nick had contact with want to go back to Syria as soon as they can. I mean, the people that were displaced by the fire up in Sonoma, like, I don't know, wherever they're living right now, they don't want to stay there. They want to go back to their homes, rebuild. I mean, that's just a normal human thing. And likewise for refugees. I mean, not everybody. The West is pretty appealing, frankly, and I mean, some percentage of people are going to want to stay here to enjoy the life that we're here for. I mean, they're the same as us. So some people will want to stay, and frankly, I mean, the immigrant population of this country has contributed enormously to our society. My father's an immigrant. In fact, he's a war refugee. He was a 2-time war refugee from the Spanish Civil War and then the Nazis in France. My first wife was an immigrant from Bulgaria. This country's better off for having those people, those good people, in our borders. So I think, to the extent that some people will want to stay, I think there's probably a net gain for us and obviously for them.
Can you talk about the organization of ISIS? Because when I watched the documentary, I just thought it was like just a group of people who were just rebels, but it seemed like they're setting up their own state inside of Syria.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing about ISIS as opposed to Al-Qaeda is that they really controlled territory. They had oil refineries. They were setting up a taxation system. They were running schools, and I mean, every aspect of a functioning modern society. They were sort of running this. They were repaving roads. They were doing all the things you would expect the state to do in exchange for giving the state taxes. I mean, that they were providing those goods and services, and that made them really different from any other terrorist group, and they are a terrorist group, obviously. They could really control quite a bit of territory in Iraq and Syria, in northern Iraq and Syria, and so they had also civil administration, a military hierarchy. Their leader, the sort of supreme leader, was named al-Baghdadi. No one's sure if he's alive or dead right now. I think people think he's probably alive, but obviously he's had better days than right now. I mean, they're really being rolled up pretty quickly in Syria, which doesn't mean that their threat is over with, but what they proclaim to be the caliphate. They declared a caliphate in the area that they controlled, harkening back to the sort of glory days of the Arab world, of the Muslim faith, that dream or nightmare has died.
Now, in the current situation, you have Kurds and you have the FSA involved,
Right.
whatnot. If ISIS is pushed out, does the FSA have enough strength to actually control the country?
Yeah, right. I forgot. I lost track of my list of players in this situation. So the Kurds are an autonomous tribal group, and their population spills into Turkey, into Iraq, into Iran, into Syria. They dream of having an independent Kurdish state, which of course is extremely threatening to all of the states that they're part of, because those states don't want Kurdish-controlled territory carved out of their national borders, particularly if Kurdish-controlled territory happens to have a lot of oil in it, which some of it does. So it's all like extremely delicate. So when the Kurds have been very, very useful allies, helpful allies in fighting ISIS, but then recently they turned around and voted for independence, which completely freaked out Iraq, and now they're fighting with their former allies in Iraq. There's potentially a regional war involving the Kurds and all of the different nations around Kurdish territory that don't want them to have independence, and see who else is involved. It's also a major confrontation between Sunni and Shia Islam. So when we invaded Iraq, the Sunni minority had political and military control of the country under Saddam Hussein and oppressed the Shia majority. When we came in, we got rid of Saddam Hussein. We started a de-Baathification program. The Ba'ath Party was the sort of nationalist party under Saddam Hussein. So we purged the military, the schools, the universities, right down to very low-level jobs. We purged them of all Baathists. Now, of course, a lot of those people were perfectly decent people, were stuck in a system where you had to be, like under communism in Eastern Europe, you had to be part of the Communist Party in order to even get a job sweeping the streets. So, of course, being in the party doesn't mean anything. Well, we purged all those people and basically created an unemployed and very bitter population who were then oppressed, murdered, rounded up, tortured, killed, murdered by the Shia government that we put into power in Baghdad. Oddly, the Shia government had of course, very strong relations with the Shia government in Iran, who's our enemy. So, no matter what we did, we were creating a contradiction in our policies. Almost kind of brilliantly contradictory policy. Like, it'd be hard to actually set out to be as contradictory as we were. So a lot of these disenfranchised Ba'ath Party leaders and generals and officers and party leaders and all that eventually started the Sunni insurgency, partly to protect the Sunni population from the Shia who were beating up on them. And eventually, when President Bush started negotiating a U.S. withdrawal from Iraq and then handed that off to Barack Obama, who sort of finished the job, in the vacuum of our withdrawal, the Shia government the Shia forces were had free rein to really abuse the Sunni population. And at that moment, ISIS was formed as a civil defense force to protect the Sunni population. And what they offered was a pathologically extreme and virulent vision of Islam in exchange for protection. And it was born in northern Iraq, it was born in Iraq. And when the Syrian civil war really got going, they saw an opportunity, they migrated into Syria, took territory, came back into Iraq and overran, I think, 5 Iraqi army divisions and took all their weapons. And they just started sort of bouncing back and forth between Syria and Iraq, grabbing more and more territory, taking over oil fields, creating oil revenue, tens, hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue now being generated by this machine, which could then pay for more arms and more jihadis. You know, the whole thing sort of snowballed. And it wasn't until recently that ground forces were able to start to roll that back.
Now, you mentioned in the documentary, Assad kind of jump-started some of the radicalism inside of Syria when he released certain people.
Yeah, so Assad knows that Western forces have a sort of soft spot for democratic movements because we're democracies. And when people rise up in Tunisia or in Egypt or wherever, or in Ukraine or wherever, I mean, it's happened in many places, the Western powers are like, oh, great, a democratic movement will overthrow this despotic regime, another spot of light, you know, sunlight in the world, like we're for that, right? So of course Assad knows that. So the FSA, they really were quite democratic and idealistic when they started. And Assad knew that that would be absolutely irresistible to Western powers who would want to arm them and give them the capability to topple his regime. Much like we armed the Afghan fighters in the 1980s so they could fight the Russians who had invaded them, right? It's sort of the same idea. So what he did, but he also knew that the West was scared of Islamic radicals. And he had a lot of Islamic radicals, I mean, straight up terrorists, in his jails. So what did he do? He released them. He released the most violent and radical Islamists in his jails and seeded the SSA with Islamic radicals, and then was able to say, look, if you topple, say to the world, if you topple me, this is what you get. You basically get Al-Qaeda in Damascus. So careful who you arm over there. So he sort of like ruined the party basically by letting these radicals out of jail. And he'd much rather fight Al-Qaeda in his own country than fight a democratic movement that's armed by the West in his own country. I mean, that is not a fight he's going to win. So as soon as he did that, then the Russians could say, we're all fighting terrorists together. And then they had their rationale for bombing, and on it went.
So for the people who are on the ground, do they talk about like what they see as a possible end game for this conflict? I mean, it seems like there's so many different pieces.
I mean, you know, the war in Afghanistan started when the Soviets invaded in 1980. You know, we're coming up on 40 years now, like, and it's still at war. And if we completely pulled out of Afghanistan, the war will get worse. I mean, that's the sort of weird delusion of the left, is that if you pull U.S. forces out of a country, things will get better. It actually, what happens is the civilian death toll will get dramatically worse if we pull out. It may be that the Syrian conflict does not, within the next couple of generations, have a solution. It's entirely possible. If there is a kind of tentative stability that allows for a drop in the suffering of civilians, it will be, I think, by a de facto partitioning of the country, where this front lines kind of stabilize and the country is divided through sort of ethnic and tribal divisions that figure out how to have a kind of stability, like in Bosnia. I mean, in Bosnia that was helped by the Dayton Peace Accords, but you know, basically it solidified frontline positions that had evolved during the war, and it sort of like solidified them as a permanent solution. And something like that may happen. I don't know, or it could easily keep going on. I mean, that, you know, that's, and the problem is you have Shia versus Sunni. You have this sort of weird axis of Putin, Assad, and Iran and Hezbollah versus the West. You know, you've got these the Kurds are in there. The Turks, the Turks are making some incredibly troubling decisions about their own country and about their foreign policy. So you have these like unbelievably problematic and self-interested parties, and there's a huge amount of oil, right? There's a huge amount of oil in these areas. Like, what else could you throw into a situation to keep it going for a long time? I mean, Afghanistan doesn't have oil. Like, no one really cares about Afghanistan. It's not like the international community is dying to get its hands on, make whatever. I mean, Syria is a nightmare compared to Afghanistan, and Afghanistan's still going on after 40 years. So I think we may be, I think one of the things that could happen is a regional war that kills 1 million people. I mean, that's entirely possible.
Very cheery. So when you were working this whole entire project, like what were your main takeaways? Like, did you?
The first thing I wanted to do is disabuse people of the idea that when a country slips into civil war, it's somehow a moral, a sort of broad moral failure by the population, that they somehow like violence and can't keep themselves from killing each other. That's just not how civil wars work. That's not how it worked in our country. Everyone forgets we had a civil war too, right? That's not how it worked in our country in the 1860s. It's not how it works. Most people are, the vast majority of people are good, decent people who don't want to be killing their neighbors. And it doesn't take very many psychopaths and nationalists and power-hungry politicians to tip a country into civil war. It really doesn't take a lot. Likewise in street demonstrations, it doesn't take a lot of sort of, Molotov cocktail throwing anarchists to turn a completely reasonable street demonstration into a riot. It really doesn't take a lot. And so I wanted people to understand that the people of Syria or of Bosnia or wherever it is, they're just decent people. They're people exactly like us. And when they flee with their children, they're not trying to take advantage of the bounty of the West and take advantage of our generosity. Fleeing their country is incredibly scary and dangerous. It's the last thing any reasonable person would want to do with their children, and yet they're doing it because they know if they don't, they're going to die. That's what an immigrant refugee population is. And the other thing I wanted to, there are two other things I wanted to explain. First of all, some of this came out of, some of it we can't control. The countries have internal dynamics of civil wars. It's not, we can't play God. Not everything that happens in the world is because we did or didn't do something. But I have to say, our invasion of Iraq in 2003 introduced a huge amount of instability and violence and death into that part of the world. I'm not defending this Saddam Hussein regime, of course. He was unspeakably evil. But just for the purposes of history, we killed something like 100,000 civilians. We introduced violence as a norm, a new norm in Iraqi society, and made some incredible blunders, like debathification. And when you traumatize a society like that, it's like traumatizing a child. It will act badly. I mean, trauma produces a result, not a good one. And so we really have to. And then the withdrawal of, then if you're going to invade a country and kind of break it, then you kind of should stay there. And we didn't do that either. I mean, in Afghanistan in the 80s, we armed the Afghans to the teeth so they could fight the Russians, which is arguably the right thing to do. Spent a huge amount of money giving them weapons. And when the Russians pulled out, what did we do? We didn't care about the Afghans. We pulled out. We didn't stay to build schools and build bridges and help the guys. No, all we were interested in was killing Russians. We actually didn't care about the Afghans. At least not judging by the money allocated by this nation afterwards. So I wanted to make the point that, we can be judgmental and whatever about, those crazy people over there that have their crazy civil war. We are part of it. And America has done enormously good things in the world too, including stopping fascism during World War II. My father grew up in Europe. He's alive because, his homeland survived, France, and survived because of us. He made that very clear to me when I was young. So we're an enormous power for good in the world as well, but we need to own our mistakes. And I would like to propose Iraq was a mistake in that sense. And finally, the public use of violence by ISIS. Taking people into the town square, pouring gasoline over them and burning them alive. Putting them in steel cages, groups of men in steel cages, and then dangling them over a swimming pool by a crane and then slowly dropping them into the water and watching them drown with underwater cameras to record it. Like, that is pure evil, right? It's an evil of the sort that is, absolutely unacceptable, and I'm glad they're being eradicated from the planet. But it's the kind of evil that every society, including our own, has indulged in. I mean, people commit public violence in order to intimidate other people. And you don't have to go very far back in American history to find public violence. I mean, the lynchings of black men in the South, I mean, those men could have been easily killed quietly in the dead of night and buried. That's not how, I mean, that's how people commit murder, right? They do it quietly and secretly. That's not what happened in the American South. The murders were done in an intentionally cruel way in the middle of town. I mean, there were ministers who would let church out early so that the congregation wouldn't miss the lynching, right? That's an attempt to intimidate the population, just like ISIS was doing. So one of the points I want to make is that ISIS must be condemned, but in the context of acknowledging that every society has used that kind of violence, and we need to acknowledge that in condemning the dark side of ISIS, we, in the same moment, we have to actually, to be intellectually honest, acknowledge the dark side that we're capable of, and thank God have transcended. But we can't forget that. We can't be too sanctimonious that they're somehow inherently different than we are. You go back 2 generations in this country, and they're really not.
Now, in the documentary, you showed how a person got radicalized and joined ISIS. I guess there's like a theory that people who join these groups because of lack of economic opportunity, and some other people think, no, it's not that, it's for other causes. Where do you land on that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole range of reasons to join ISIS. I mean, if you're Syrian and ISIS rolls into your hometown in pickup trucks, a really compelling reason to join ISIS is that they'll kill you if you don't, right? So there's that to some sort of economic opportunity in those areas for disenfranchised people that are going to join feel like they need to join the winning team to survive. And then if you move to like the European population, why would it was mostly middle-class kids that joined ISIS. Like, why would a middle-class kid in Europe of Arab or of Arab descent, but not an immigrant, not a refugee, right? Someone who was born in France or in England, of Arab descent, middle-class kid who's in school and university, whatever. Why would they join ISIS? They're not economically desperate people. Actually, that's not the kind of people who join ISIS. They're too busy working. I mean, they're too busy trying to work and support their families. It's really middle-class kids. And teenagers are particularly vulnerable to sort of utopian visions. And what ISIS wasn't trying to lure them in to their movement by showing beheading videos, right? Because then you only get the psychopaths. And psychopaths can be useful, but you can't have a whole army of psychopaths. There just aren't enough of them, right? So what they did to lure people is to give them a vision of a utopia. And so they had these incredibly, these videos of incredibly high production values showing, a family in ISIS territory having a picnic by a lake, things like that. Just this sort of utopian, idealized vision of life inside the caliphate. And also just the whole idea of the caliphate is finally standing up to the West and reclaiming this very real sort of historical, the sort of lost golden age of Islam, and the sort of very real dignity that the Arab world had in regards to the West, that had been lost. And they're very conscious that it's been lost. And and totally reasonable, they want to reclaim it. I mean, we would too, right? And so what they do is these videos that they put out there were showing in a very glowing sort of light this utopia that you could come join. And also, young people want to be something bigger than themselves, greater than themselves. There's a great band, Queens of the Stone Age, and they have a lyrics to I can't remember the name of the song, but the lyric is, she wanted something to die for to make it beautiful to live. That's ISIS. I mean, that's the appeal of ISIS. That's the appeal of, in the 1930s going over and, fighting the Spanish Civil War. And that's exactly what's going on with those kids in Europe. And then they get over there and they realize it's a complete lie, and it's a horribly abusive and depraved organization. But then it's too late. Then they're basically stuck.
Now, the U.S. is increasing our involvement. I heard recently we have some troops now on the ground, and I guess I think we're working with the Kurds to a degree or something. Do you see U.S. involvement increasing? We're going to have more soldiers as time goes on.
Yeah, there's a Marine Expeditionary Unit. There's a bunch of 155s over there, artillery over there. They've got aircraft flying out of northern Iraq, I guess. I don't really know the tactical details, but yeah, there are U.S. forces over there. They're focused on defeating ISIS. I don't know exactly what they're going to do when ISIS is gone and different militia groups that they were allied with, including the Kurds, start fighting with each other to control the areas that ISIS used to occupy, particularly the oil fields. I don't know what. So are U.S. forces then going to become peacekeeping forces? I'm not sure exactly what's going to happen. I'm not sure the administration knows exactly what's going to happen. If Turkey decides that that parts of those areas really should be Turkey, Mosul, they feel that Mosul is a Turkish city. I mean, Mosul is in northern Iraq. I don't know, how's that going to go? I mean, there's a expeditionary unit in between Turkey and Mosul. It's going to have to stay there to keep Turkey from trying to claim a piece. It's a huge mess. And, the administration right now, the Trump administration, is juggling an awful lot of very complicated situations. I hope they have the bandwidth to figure out a wise course of action, a wise strategy in that area. I hope they do. I wouldn't say it's likely that they do, but I hope they do. I mean, for our sake and for the sake of the people over there. I mean, there's a lot of innocent people still stuck in that country. They really don't need Western powers making more mistakes, with that area.
Now, in your documentary, you're limited because you have to air it on cable and whatnot. Were there things that you wanted to include in the documentary but you didn't have enough time to include?
Oh, anytime you make a 90-minute film, you really feel like you should have made a 100-minute film, or this is actually 100 minutes. Every time you make a 100-minute film, you think it should have been a 120-minute film. The truth is, 100 minutes is about as much time as people can kind of really concentrate on something difficult, and this is definitely difficult. So, yeah, there's always stuff that drops out. The beauty of the internet is that you can put that content that didn't go into the film. You can put it on you can put it on a website and say, oh, if you want a more expansive story about this refugee family, here it is. And so we made these sort of mini films that broadened some of these topics that we had to sort of confine and cut short. So all that stuff sort of lives online, and it's actually a kind of pretty cool use for that material.
Mm-hmm. Do we have any audience questions? We'll get you a mic in a second.
Hi, thanks for taking the time here. And I'd never heard that thing about the 100-minute attention span, and was wondering where you got that from.
Oh, I mean, that's not data. I mean, that's not research. It's just that's my sense from watching a lot of films and from making a lot of films. 100 minutes seems to be just about the limit. I mean, you can go to 2 hours, whatever, but if you go to 2 hours, trust me, the audience will know you've gone to 2 hours. And you don't really want your audience thinking about how long the film is. Like, as soon as that, you know what I mean? It's like on a first date. You don't want your date thinking, wow, we've been having dinner for 2 hours. Like, that's not a good sign. Same with filmmaking.
So I wanted to understand your viewpoint on ISIS vis-a-vis the Taliban. They seem to have had similar structures in terms of carving out territory, providing basic services, promises, and the rest, but ISIS is a bit more brutal, of course, it seems. So what's your take?
Oh, yeah, I mean, the Taliban were conducting public executions. They were stoning adulterers in a sports arena, for example. But the Taliban weren't a terrorist organization. I mean, they were terroristic towards their own population, I think. They were extremely abusive. And so were a lot of right-wing regimes as well. I mean, brutality is brutality. But they weren't attacking the West. And from the West's perspective, and we are Westerners, right? From our perspective, you become a terrorist when you attack us. And
housing Osama bin Laden.
Well, yes.
And thus, it seemed like they were housing Osama bin Laden, and so it was this default attack on the West.
Absolutely, they were, and that was problematic. But they themselves, they started in the madrasas of Pakistan. Their entire focus was bringing their vision of sort of pure, and we would argue radical Islam to Afghanistan. That was their entire focus. They weren't trying to use Afghanistan as a base to attack the West. Now, they did host bin Laden, and Al-Qaeda is a terrorist organization. And so when they finally really got our attention. It took a while to get our attention, right? I mean, Al-Qaeda attacked us a few times, and we kept sort of like, oh, okay, that didn't hurt too much. It took a few tries before we actually really focused on them. And of course, that was 9/11. And after 9/11 happened, the United States was like, George Bush said to the Taliban leadership, turn over Al-Qaeda. Turn over the Al-Qaeda leadership. We will not invade your country. We'll actually come and help you because you need help, right? If you don't turn them over, we will come after them, and you will become our enemy as well. I didn't vote for George Bush. I disagree with a lot of his policies, but I thought that was an incredibly sort of sage and reasonable reaction in the heat of the moment after 9/11 that he did that. I thought was really admirable. Very stupidly, the Taliban said, no, they're our guests, and we went in and got them. It took a while, and we made a huge number of mistakes, but that was a war that made sense to me. And I was over there in 2000 with Massoud fighting the Taliban. I was there in 2001 with his commanders when they took Kabul, with the U.S. Air Force overhead. The Afghans were overjoyed at what was happening, right? We could have done a huge amount of good there. We really could have. We left 15,000 troops in Afghanistan. 15,000. That's it. And there's 40,000 cops in New York City. We left 15,000 American soldiers in the country that produced the worst attack on American soil since Pearl Harbor, right? And we went on to Iraq, a country that had nothing to do with it. And that we lost the war in Afghanistan in Baghdad, basically, in my opinion. And so the Taliban and ISIS, what do they share? Now, in terms of their vision of Islam and how to run a society, they're very similar. ISIS is more extreme, a little more spectacular in their brutality, definitely more media savvy for sure. But it's the same radical vision of Islam that my friend Sarah Shays points out. Sarah, she's a childhood friend, and she's a former NPR reporter. When 9/11 happened, she went to Pakistan, bought a motorcycle, and drove into Kandahar and rented a house in Kandahar while the Taliban were still in control of Kandahar. And she's also a Harvard graduate, an incredibly smart woman. And she really knows the Arab, she learned Pashtun, really knows the Arab world. Amazing woman. She wrote a book called Thieves of State. And she examined the role of corruption. And what she found was that the common denominator in all of these radical Islamic movements that are so brutal and violent, the Shabab in Somalia, Boko Haram, the Taliban, ISIS, the common denominator in all of those movements is that they got traction in the population, not because the population loved the idea of radical Islam. Who would really, right? That's not a fun way to live. They got traction because they would promise to stop the corruption, the incredible corruption of an oppressive regime. Every one of those countries was just crippled with government corruption. The governments were basically criminal cartels that existed to enrich themselves. And these radical movements would say, okay, if you adopt our vision of Islam, we will protect you from the tyranny of this government and its corruption. And people reluctantly would be like, okay, that's a good deal. And I remember when I was in Kabul, Afghanistan, in the summer of 1996, I got shot at by a Taliban machine gun position on the outskirts of town. And me and the translator guy who was Afghan, he's Pashtun, that I was working with, we got behind cover, we got out of there. And he said, we hate those people. We hate them. But we're going to let them in because we can no longer live with the corruption of this government. And they promised to clean up corruption. So if we want to fight terrorism, we can fight terrorism really effectively by fighting corruption, particularly corruption with governments that we're allied with and do business with, particularly those governments. We won't have to fight terrorism, right? Because it won't gain root. We're completely screwing ourselves and wasting a lot of lives of very good people.
That reminds me of what happened in Iran. with the fall of the
Yeah,
fall of the
of
Shah,
course.
right?
Yeah, yeah.
One more question.
Yeah.
Follow-up question. Do you see ISIS changing once they don't hold territory? As I understand it, their original ideology is they are the caliphate, they're the following the Quran. If they don't hold territory, they no longer have a mandate. Is that completely made up, or did you see?
I mean,
anything changing?
I don't know a regime that doesn't change the rules of the game when they lose the game, right? I mean, including our own administration. I mean, you lose a vote in Congress, and you just change what the vote was about. I mean, no problem. So I mean, that's just, I mean, not to pick on you know who, but I mean, that's totally human behavior, right? So ISIS is going to do that too. I'd do it. I mean, of course, right? So yeah, they lose their mandate. They'll change what their the basis for their mandate, and they'll continue saying what they want to say to expand their power base. I mean, of course.
So you mentioned kind of this rise of corruption and then people wanting to, combat it. But then you also talked about kind of this tipping point where there's this point where it takes not too much to nudge people into the violence and then the cascade to civil war. How, as you've observed these, would you define as far as like indicators or warnings that tipping point is beginning to happen? Because I think anytime you see corruption, there's people that are fighting against it.
I mean, listen, people might be willing to die, but they're not willing to let their children die. And when a population gets to the point where there's a reasonable chance their children will die, they will do anything. They will walk across several international borders to safety, right? They will sell a kidney on the black market. I mean, they will do absolutely anything, including breaking into a military storehouse and grabbing a bunch of AKs and a couple of magazines and fighting as best they can. They'll do that too. So where's that tipping point? That tipping point is when the security forces are detaining and torturing and killing people, particularly children, when they're, firing heavy machine gun fire into crowds of protesting people who are peaceful, mothers, children, whatever. Like, when that starts to happen, and if it goes on for too long, that's the tipping point. And it would be the tipping point in this country, right? I mean, if that happened in this country, we'd all be grabbing weapons, right? I mean, to defend our families, of course. I mean, we're the products of evolution. We're the products of individuals that made certain choices to survive. We're the product of that, right? So of course we would protect ourselves.
We came close to that, I think, after the Revolutionary War, during the Whiskey Rebellion and the debtors' crisis. The Continental soldiers going out fighting for the country, and then debtors coming in and taking their livelihoods.
Right.
And then during the Depression, during the bonus army fight, when the military came after the veterans who were trying to get their benefits from World War I. So.
Yeah, right, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, human behavior doesn't change very much, so.
Hi, how are you doing? So I have a question. What are your current thoughts about the situation that's happening in Iraq right now with, they retook the city, and there's just this huge power vacuum between the Iraqi Kurds and, with the other people involved in government. What are your thoughts on that? Like, what's the future for Iraq looking like right now?
I mean, I don't know. I'm not an expert, and I didn't cover Iraq because I didn't think I could be objective. I mean, back in '03, I was so against the war, and I wasn't at all against the war in Afghanistan. I thought we could do some good. I was so against the war in Iraq, I refused to cover it because I didn't think I could be objective. So I'm not an expert in Iraq. I'm guessing. Things tend to slide towards violence in countries that are destabilized like that, and those are obviously destabilized countries, and they're also at this point deeply traumatized. I mean, everyone in those countries has been exposed to really quite a lot of violence, and so I'm just going to guess that vacuum will create turf wars that will trigger another phase of a regional war. I hope not, but I wouldn't be surprised.
I think about the psychology of the children. Since we've been in Afghanistan since 2001, now there's kids who've been alive for 16 years and all they've known is war. Or then with Iraq, all they've known is war for 14 years. I mean, they must have a...
Yeah, I mean, we're almost at the point where young American soldiers fighting in Afghanistan were born after 9/11. But we're not alive on 9/11. That's pretty amazing. And as far as the Afghans go, there's children whose parents have known nothing but war, right? I mean, it's incredible. And that's not their fault. They didn't ask to be invaded by the Soviets. They didn't ask to have America load their country full of weapons and then pull out. Like, they didn't ask for any of that. They didn't ask to have Pakistan arm and organize and train a radical Islamic militia and send it across the borders as the Taliban to take over. They didn't ask for any of that.
Thanks for being here, Sebastian. It's been very interesting to hear you speak about this so far. I just have a question about the documentary, and you mentioned the method was self-documentation. So I'm assuming that you and Nick, seeing the footage after the fact and, on the cutting room floor and kind of going through all of this, what was that process like? I imagine it must have been intense at points to see certain parts that were recorded days or weeks after.
Yeah, of course. I mean, yeah, some of the footage was upsetting, but mostly your job as director is to create a narrative that's compelling and provides a vehicle to communicate important information. I don't want it to just be a history lesson because people won't watch the full 100 minutes. If it's just a series of personal stories, you may allow for a human connection with the viewers, and that's lovely. And it's important, but you also need a bit of a history lesson to understand why those humans are having that experience, right? So all the different kinds of footage we had from the family and from the other shooters we had in the field, we had access to a kind of trove of ISIS footage that ISIS had shot through some kind of digital backdoor that I don't understand that someone sort of found for us. And so we had access to their, a sort of ISIS database of footage that they shot. So we had all kinds of stuff. Some of it was super upsetting. Some of it was incredibly, motivating and encouraging. I mean, people, one of the strange things, this is my book Tribe is about this, the closer to a front line you are, the more of a crisis there is, the better people act. People within their communities act incredibly well, and they act better and better as things get worse and worse. And so one of the things you see in a war zone is people acting with unbelievable nobility and generosity and courage. I mean, just extraordinary. In a way that they don't have to in an affluent suburb like the kind that I grew up in. I never saw noble human behavior. I didn't see any bad human behavior either. But I certainly didn't see any courage or anything. Like, why, wasn't any need for courage, which is actually kind of a shame.
We'll do two more questions. I just want to do a question. Can you talk about the White Helmets in Syria?
Yeah, so the White Helmets were a civil defense organization that was organized sort of organically, spontaneously to rush into areas that had been bombed by Assad's Air Force or later the Russian Air Force and dig survivors out of the rubble and dig the corpses out of the rubble to give to the families. And often those guys would get killed because there'd be a second bombing attack on the same spot to kill the first responders. Incredibly brave, unbelievably brave young people doing that.
Okay.
Oh, go ahead.
Okay, quick question.
Yeah.
I hope. The first is the war on terror moving to Africa, as may be evident by some of the recent accounts? And then secondly, you mentioned Iraq being a mistake. Are we on a course for the same type of mistake with North Korea? And perhaps would your team and company do the same in terms of gathering information inside North Korea like you did with Syria?
That was a short question. All right. All right.
I'll give you 30 minutes to respond.
Yeah, right.
Go for it.
I don't know anything about North Korea other than what I read in the paper, which is the same as what you read in the paper. I got similar worries, I'm sure, and also maybe an unrealistic sense that people don't do just for the hell of it the worst thing imaginable. I just have to assume that. So is the war on terror moving to North Africa? I mean, it's been there for 20 years, right? I mean, the Shabab, in 1993, Black Hawk Down, Somalia was already, is that terrorism? Yeah, it's an incredibly troubled place. The Shabab is absolutely a terror organization, as is Boko Haram. And their Al-Qaeda affiliated groups have existed in the Sahara, in the Sahel, for years and years. This isn't new. And of course, we don't want to fight those wars ourselves. We can't fight everywhere. But those groups are legitimate threats. I mean, an Al-Qaeda affiliated group took over northern Mali and overran Timbuktu and destroyed all of these beautiful monuments. I mean, mosques and things, like destroyed them, right? And killed a lot of the population and were driven out by French military action, thank God. But I mean, that's an important issue, not just for the security of the West, but for the dignity and the safety of the people who live in those areas. And so we can't fight all those wars. We shouldn't fight all those wars, but one thing we can do is have military trainers and advisors there to help these military forces in those countries that are often very ill-equipped and ill-trained, sort of get them up to speed so they can fight their own fights. I mean, that to me is a completely legitimate use of American power and knowledge. And so no, this isn't new. And it's not, someone asked me about like US forces in those areas and why are we there? And someone else said, oh, it's oil interests. And I'm like, come on, that's not, I mean, first of all, you drive a damn car. So like, you're not allowed to be upset about us protecting oil interests around the world as long as you're using that shit, right? Like, sorry, that's just too hypocritical. But also, that's ignoring the fact that these Al-Qaeda affiliated groups are incredibly abusive to the local population. I mean, just like remember that. They're horrible.
Hi. So, going back to Restrepo and Tribe, have you given any thought to revisiting the Platoon 5, 10, 15 years from now in the context of Tribe? And possibly, second question, expanding Tribe into like a feature documentary, because it's super interesting stuff.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, the Platoon is not a platoon anymore, obviously. It's dispersed, and most of those guys are now out of the military, and they're leading their lives. And I don't think I'll track them down. And I mean, I don't know quite how I would. I don't quite see the narrative for how I would make a film about that.
You talk a lot about PTSD.
Yeah.
The brotherhood that comes out of tragic events.
Yeah.
You guys from my platoon, when I was in Iraq, I feel like the deepest brotherhood with them, just because we went through the stuff we went through.
Yeah.
But like my high school football team, before I went to Iraq, they were like my brothers, but then now I won't even go to a high school reunion. So in that kind of context.
I mean, I'm not in touch with all those guys. I'm close to one guy in particular that we're really good friends. I'm in some kind of contact with some of the others. I'm not sure they're in that much contact with each other either. So I'm not sure there's a real story there. I hear what you're saying, but I think most of those guys have constructed their own lives and sort of moved on. A few stayed in the military, but not many. If I thought there was a story there, I'd think about it. But also, I am moving on from the topic of war, very deliberately. So I think, Tribe, obviously, a little part of it's about PTSD, but mostly it's about our society and community. And I'm definitely going to keep going in that direction. I mean, war, I can't imagine having not covered war. It's part of who I am. I like to think I've been a helpful contributor in a good way to our country's conversation about war, our understanding of war. I mean, I like to think I've done some good. The experience has been sometimes painful, but also extremely positive for me, having been a war reporter. But I actually want to move out of that. I mean, there is a kind of there is a psychological consequence to engaging in war, in the topic of war. I mean, it doesn't cost nothing, psychologically and morally, and I'm sort of done with it.
Well, thank you for joining us to talk about the Hell on Earth documentary. This concludes our first part of the interview, but let's give Sebastian a round of applause for his time.
Thank you. Thank you.